If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1, Before Heaven Turned, Shang Power and Zhou Origins. Part 1, On the Banks of the Yellow River, the world of early Shang rule. Picture a vast muddy river cutting through endless plains, its waters carrying rich silt that would feed the world's first great civilization. This was the Yellow River Valley around 1600 BCE, where the Shang people built something remarkable. They created bronze weapons and tools so advanced that neighboring tribes could only dream of such craftsmanship. They raised massive earthen walls around their cities and built palaces that reached toward the sky. The Shang king was not just a ruler, he was the bridge between earth and heaven itself. Every morning, his priests would heat animal bones until they cracked, reading the patterns like a divine message. Should we plant crops this season? Will the harvest be good? Should we attack our enemies? The bones would tell them, speaking for ancestors who had died long ago but still guided the living. In the capital city, bronze foundries glowed day and night. Skilled workers poured molten metal into clay molds, creating ceremonial vessels covered with intricate designs of dragons and spirits. These were not just decorations. They were sacred objects that connected the royal family to their dead ancestors. The Shang believed their ancestors lived on in another realm, still caring for their descendants, but needing regular offerings of food and wine. The king's power flowed down through layers of nobles, each controlling their own piece of land. Farmers worked the fields, growing millet and wheat in the fertile river soil. When enemies threatened, the king could summon armies of bronze-armored warriors, riding horse-drawn chariots, a technology that made them nearly unstoppable against tribes still fighting with stone weapons. But perhaps most important was how the Shang understood their right to rule. They believed that Tian, the great force of heaven itself, had chosen their royal family to govern the world below. Heaven watched everything, judging whether kings ruled with wisdom and virtue. As long as the Shang king performed the proper rituals, made the right sacrifices, and governed justly, heaven would support him with good harvests, military victories, and peaceful borders. This was the sophisticated world that dominated ancient China for over 400 years. The Shang seemed unshakable, blessed by heaven and armed with the finest bronze weapons in the known world. Their oracle bones revealed divine will. Their ancestors guided every decision, and their king commanded respect from the Yellow River to the distant mountains. Yet far to the west, in the Wei River Valley, another people watched and learned. They were called the Zhou, and they lived on the frontier between civilization and wilderness. They served the Shang as border guards and tribute bearers, but they were also students of their master's strengths and weaknesses. The Zhou would soon test whether heaven's favor was truly permanent, or whether it might shift to those who proved themselves more worthy. Part 2, Border Lords in the West, the early Zhou clan and their ancestral line. The Zhou started as outsiders looking in, while the Shang ruled from their grand cities with bronze weapons and oracle bones. The Zhou lived far to the west in the Wei River Valley. This was frontier country, where farmland met grassland, and where tough people made their living through both crops and cattle. The Zhou served two masters. They owed tribute to the Shang king, sending grain and livestock eastward along dusty trade routes. But they also had to defend their own borders against nomadic tribes who swept down from the northern steppes. This double duty shaped them into something unique. They were farmers who could fight like warriors, and warriors who understood the value of good harvests. Their position taught them valuable lessons. Zhou traders and tribute bearers traveled regularly to Shang cities, where they saw bronze workshops, observed court ceremonies, and learned the writing system. They brought these skills back home, but adapted them to their own needs. Zhou bronze workers created weapons suited for cavalry warfare. Zhou scribes recorded their own clan histories alongside Shang administrative techniques. The Wei River Valley became a melting pot of ideas. Zhou leaders married into neighboring tribes, creating webs of alliance that stretched across the western regions. They welcomed refugees from Shang territories, including craftsmen and scholars who brought inside knowledge of Shang's strengths and weaknesses. These newcomers helped build Zhou military capabilities while sharing stories of growing discontent in the east. Geography gave the Zhou advantages their masters never fully grasped. The western mountains bred hardy horses, perfect for mounted warfare. The scattered valleys forced Zhou communities to develop independent leadership, rather than relying on distant kings. The constant threat from nomadic raiders created a military culture where every adult could fight when needed. Zhou ancestral traditions grew distinct from Shang practices. While the Shang focused on divination and royal bloodlines, the Zhou emphasized moral leadership and personal virtue. Their legendary ancestors were remembered not just as great warriors, but as wise rulers who cared for their people. Stories of the ancient duke and his sons stressed justice, hard work, and respect for heaven's will. By the 11th century BCE, the Zhou had grown from simple border guards into a regional power. Their armies combined Shang bronze technology with nomadic horse tactics. Their territories produced surplus food to feed soldiers and support allied tribes. Most importantly, their leaders had developed a different vision of legitimate rule. They watched Shang courts grow corrupt and distant, while Zhou communities thrived under leaders who stayed close to their people. The student was becoming strong enough to challenge the teacher. The Zhou had learned everything the Shang could offer, but they had also learned something more: that power without virtue was weakness, and that heaven might choose new favorites when old ones forgot their duties. Part 3. Signs of Decay, Dixin's Court, Luxury and the Erosion of Shang Authority. King Dixin took the throne of the Shang dynasty at a time when the kingdom's wealth seemed endless. Gold flowed into royal treasuries from distant provinces. Farmers sent grain from fertile river valleys. Craftsmen created bronze vessels so beautiful they took your breath away. But having everything you could want can be dangerous, especially when you forget why you have it in the first place. The new king looked at his riches and decided they existed for his pleasure alone. He ordered workers to build a massive palace complex called the Deer Terrace Pavilion. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement written in stone and gold. Towers reached toward the clouds. Gardens sprawled for miles. Rooms glittered with precious metals and rare gems. The construction consumed so much labor and materials that entire regions struggled to meet the king's demands. Money poured out of the royal treasury like water through a broken dam. Dixin threw feasts that lasted for days. Musicians, dancers, and entertainers filled his halls. Wine flowed freely while guests gorged themselves on exotic delicacies. The king seemed to believe these celebrations proved his power, but they only showed how disconnected he had become from the real world beyond his palace walls. When nobles dared question his spending, Dixin's response was swift and brutal. Some critics simply disappeared. Others faced torture devices that became legendary for their cruelty. The king surrounded himself with people who told him only what he wanted to hear. Anyone who spoke uncomfortable truths found themselves branded as traitors. The beautiful consort Daji became the king's closest companion. Court whispers blamed her for encouraging his worst impulses. Whether she truly influenced his decisions or simply provided a convenient scapegoat for angry nobles, her presence became a symbol of how the king had abandoned traditional Shang values. Wise advisors found their counsel ignored, while Daji's word carried tremendous weight. Noble families who had served the Shang dynasty for generations watched these changes with growing alarm. Their loyalty had been rewarded with suspicion. Their wealth disappeared into Dixin's endless projects. Their sons died in meaningless military campaigns launched to feed the king's ego rather than protect the kingdom's interests. Even the gods seemed angry. Solar eclipses darkened the sky at crucial moments. Floods destroyed crops despite careful irrigation. Comets appeared in unusual patterns. The royal diviners, whose job was to read heaven's will through oracle bones and ritual ceremonies, delivered increasingly ominous warnings. But Di Xin dismissed these signs as superstition or blamed his advisors for misinterpreting divine messages. Common people felt the burden through crushing taxes. Farmers gave up more grain than ever before. Artisans worked longer hours for less reward. Soldiers fought wars that enriched no one except the royal court. The social contract between ruler and ruled, that kings protected their people in exchange for loyalty, began to crumble. Word of these problems reached the Western territories, where Zhou leaders observed everything with careful attention. They saw how corruption was eating away at Shang's strength from within. They watched noble families grow restless and commoners suffer under impossible demands. Most importantly, they recognized that a kingdom losing heaven's favor was a kingdom ready to fall. Part 4. Heaven Whispers in the West. King Wen's Imprisonment, Release and Moral Vision. Far to the west, in the Wei River Valley, a man named Jiang ruled the Zhou people with a different vision of power. While Di Xin built pleasure palaces and demanded crushing taxes, Jiang kept his people's burdens light and listened when they brought problems to his court. His reputation for wisdom and fairness spread beyond Zhou borders, reaching the ears of nobles and commoners alike throughout the kingdom. This growing influence made Di Xin nervous. A Western lord who won too much loyalty from other people's subjects was dangerous. When reports reached the Shang capital that Jiang was consulting ancient divination texts and gathering wise advisors around him, Di Xin decided to act. He summoned Jiang to court under the pretense of a routine audience, then threw him into prison. For months, Jiang sat in a dark cell while Di Xin tried to decide his fate. Some court officials whispered that the Zhou leader should be executed as a potential rebel. Others argued that killing such a respected figure might anger other regional lords. Meanwhile, Jiang's sons and advisors worked desperately to secure his release. Finally, through a combination of substantial tribute payments and careful diplomacy, they convinced Di Xin to let their father go. The Shang king calculated that a humbled Jiang would be less dangerous than a martyred one. He was wrong. Jiang returned to Zhou territory with new understanding of how corrupt the Shang court had become. He had seen the waste, the cruelty, and the disconnect between rulers and ruled. More importantly, he had witnessed how easily a king could lose touch with the cosmic order that supposedly justified his power. Back home, Jiang began implementing the kind of governance he believed heaven truly favored. He reduced tax burdens on farmers and merchants. He established fair courts where even poor people could seek justice. He recruited talented individuals regardless of their birth, bringing brilliant advisors like the fishing sage Ziya into his inner circle. Most significantly, Jiang started teaching a revolutionary idea. True kingship, he argued, came not just from inheriting a throne, but from moral character and virtuous rule. Heaven, he claimed, watched how rulers treated their people and would support those who governed with wisdom and compassion, while abandoning those who ruled through fear and greed. This principle spread through private conversations and secret meetings between Zhou representatives and discontented nobles from other territories. Many regional lords had grown tired of Di Xin's excessive demands and arbitrary punishments. They began to see Jiang not just as a fellow aristocrat, but as a potential alternative to Shang rule. As years passed, Jiang's reputation as a sage king grew stronger, while Di Xin's legitimacy continued to weaken. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reshape Chinese civilization. Though Jiang himself would not live to see its completion. Part 5. Prophecy and Preparation, Omens, Alliances, and the First Articulation of a Heavenly Mandate. The signs began appearing in the sky long before anyone dared speak of rebellion. Strange comets streaked across the heavens, their tails pointing ominously toward the Shang capital. Solar eclipses darkened the land at unexpected times, and the season seemed confused. Summer arrived late, winter lingered too long, and floods came when they should not. To the ancient Chinese, these were not random events, but messages from heaven itself. Jiang watched these omens carefully from his court in the west. His advisors, skilled in reading celestial signs, whispered that heaven was growing angry with the Shang. The diviners cast their bones and studied the cracks, finding patterns that confirmed what many already suspected. The divine approval that had once blessed the Shang dynasty was slowly being withdrawn. But Jiang was too wise to rely on omens alone. He knew that successful revolt required more than angry stars. Quietly, he began reaching out to other regional lords who shared his frustrations with Dixin's rule. These meetings happened in secret, disguised as hunting trips or religious ceremonies. Lords from distant territories would arrive at Zhou lands, claiming to seek trade agreements. But their real purpose was darker. Each visitor brought stories of Shang excess and cruelty. One lord described how Dixin had demanded half his annual harvest to fund another pleasure palace. Another told of nobles tortured for questioning royal policies. These conversations slowly built a network of discontent that stretched across the Shang realm like invisible threads. During these gatherings, Jiang began articulating a revolutionary idea. He suggested that heaven's favor was not permanently tied to any single family line. Instead, it flowed to whoever ruled with virtue and wisdom. This concept would later become known as the Mandate of Heaven. But in these early days, it was spoken carefully and only among trusted allies. The Zhou court welcomed refugees from Dixin's increasingly paranoid rule. Talented officials who had fled the Shang capital found sanctuary in Zhou territory, bringing valuable intelligence about court factions and military preparations. These defectors helped Jiang understand his enemy's weaknesses while strengthening his own administration with experienced hands. Meanwhile, Zhou military preparations proceeded under the guise of border defense. Training exercises increased, weapons production expanded, and alliances with neighboring tribes grew stronger. To outside observers, the Zhou simply appeared to be protecting their frontier territories, but insiders knew they were preparing for something much larger. As these preparations intensified, ritual specialists worked to legitimize Zhou claims. They performed ceremonies designed to show heaven's approval for Zhou leadership. Ancient texts were consulted, genealogies were traced, and religious justifications were carefully crafted. Every detail mattered, because challenging the Shang meant challenging a divine mandate that had lasted for centuries. Yet, as all these elements came together, fate intervened. Jiang died before he could complete his grand design, leaving his son Jifa to inherit both the burden and the opportunity of fulfilling what they believed was heaven's will. Chapter 2. The Day Heaven Chose, From King Wen's Plans to the Battle of Muye. Part 1. After the sage's death, King Wu ascends and inherits an unfinished revolt. When King Wen died around 1050 BCE, his son Jifa faced an enormous burden. He became King Wu, but he inherited much more than a throne. His father had built a powerful coalition of allies, created a new way of thinking about royal power, and started a revolution against the mighty Shang dynasty. Now it was up to Wu to finish what his father had begun. The young king's first challenge was keeping his own family united. The Zhou clan had many princes and nobles who might have questioned Wu's leadership. Some brothers and cousins had their own ambitions. Wu needed to show strength without creating enemies within his own house. He moved carefully. confirming the loyalty of key family members while making it clear that he alone would lead the rebellion his father had planned. Wu's smartest decision was keeping Jiang Ziya as his chief advisor. This old strategist had served King Wen faithfully and knew all the secret plans for attacking the Shang. Jiang Ziya understood how to manage the coalition of allied lords that King Wen had spent years building. Without this experienced counselor, Wu might have lost the network of supporters that made victory possible. The new king also continued his father's policy of fair and gentle rule. This wasn't just about being nice to people. Wu knew that his claim to power rested on being morally better than the cruel Shang rulers. Every decision he made had to prove that heaven favored the Zhou because they treated people well. He kept taxes low, settled disputes fairly, and made sure his soldiers behaved properly when they traveled through allied territories. Managing the alliance network proved tricky. Many lords had promised to support King Wen, but would they follow his young son? Wu had to visit important allies personally, renew old agreements, and convince new partners to join the cause. Each meeting required careful diplomacy. These regional leaders needed to believe that supporting Wu was safer than staying loyal to the Shang. Perhaps most importantly, Wu had to transform his father's careful planning into real action. King Wen had built the coalition slowly and avoided open war, but Wu faced pressure from allies who expected results. Some wanted immediate action, while others feared the consequences of rebellion. Wu had to balance these competing demands while preparing for the massive military campaign that would determine whether heaven truly favored the Zhou. Wu began making public speeches that framed the coming war as a sacred duty rather than mere conquest. He claimed that heaven had already decided to remove the corrupt Shang dynasty. The Zhou were simply heaven's chosen instruments to restore proper order to the world. This message helped unite his diverse coalition behind a common moral purpose. The psychological challenge was immense. Wu had to appear confident that heaven supported him while privately worrying about whether his forces were strong enough to defeat the still powerful Shang. One mistake could destroy everything his father had built and bring terrible punishment on the Zhou people. The weight of cosmic responsibility pressed down on the young king as he prepared to test whether heaven had truly chosen his family to rule. Part 2. Jiang Ziya's Stratagems, Forging a Coalition Against Shang. The old man's weathered hands moved across the map like a master craftsman planning his greatest work. Jiang Ziya had lived 70 years waiting for this moment when his wisdom could reshape the world. King Wu had inherited his father's dream of overthrowing the Shang, but dreams meant nothing without the right allies. The aged strategist knew that no single kingdom could defeat the mighty Shang dynasty. They needed a coalition so powerful that even heaven would take notice. Jiang Ziya understood something crucial about human nature. Fear ruled most people's decisions. The regional lords whispered among themselves about Shang cruelty, but they whispered quietly. Open rebellion meant death if they failed. The strategist's genius lay in transforming their fear of the Shang into something stronger. Moral outrage that demanded action. He traveled personally to each potential ally, never sending messengers for the most important conversations. In palace halls and military camps, he painted vivid pictures of Shang tyranny. He described King Dixin's torture chambers, his drunken feasts while people starved, his corruption of sacred rituals. But Jiang Ziya always ended these meetings with the same message. Heaven itself demanded justice. This wasn't rebellion against legitimate authority. It was heaven's own command to restore proper order. The old strategist moved like a spider weaving an intricate web. He arranged marriages between Zhou nobles and the daughters of allied lords. These weren't just political unions, but sacred bonds that made betrayal unthinkable. He sent trusted agents deep into Shang territory, gathering information about troop movements, economic troubles, and palace intrigue. His spies returned with golden intelligence. The Shang were weaker than they appeared. military coordination presented another challenge entirely. Each allied kingdom brought different fighting styles, weapons, and traditions. Jiang Ziya established training camps where Zhou officers taught standardized tactics. Soldiers from different regions learned to fight as one force, responding to the same signals and supporting each other in battle. This careful preparation would prove decisive when the fighting began. Perhaps most importantly, Jiang Ziya controlled the narrative spreading across the land. Stories traveled faster than armies in ancient China. His agents shared carefully crafted tales of Zhou virtue contrasted with Shang wickedness. Common people began viewing the Zhou not as ambitious conquerors, but as heaven's chosen rescuers. Public opinion shifted dramatically in their favor. The master strategist watched and calculated constantly. He tracked every alliance formed, every Shang mistake, every sign of growing support. Like a farmer waiting for the perfect harvest moment, he advised patience until conditions aligned perfectly. Too early meant failure. Too late meant missed opportunity. When the moment came, their coalition would be so strong that victory seemed inevitable rather than desperate. As the second year passed since King Wu's accession, Jiang Ziya sensed the cosmic scales tipping toward the Zhou. Part 3. The Ford of Mengjin, the First Eastern March and the Decision to Wait. The moment came in the spring when King Wu decided to test heaven's will. He sent word across the alliance network that all faithful lords should gather their warriors and march eastward. This was no mere military exercise. This was a divine examination to see if heaven truly supported their cause against the Shang. From across the Zhou territories and beyond, allied forces began moving toward the Yellow River. The sight amazed even seasoned veterans. 300 lords answered the call, each bringing their best soldiers. Banners from dozens of different clans and regions fluttered in the spring breeze. The coalition that King Wen had dreamed of and Jiang Ziya had carefully built was finally taking physical form. The great gathering point was Mengjin, a strategic ford where armies could cross the mighty Yellow River. For generations, this crossing had marked the boundary between Zhou territory and the Shang heartland beyond. Now it would serve as the stage for a cosmic drama. King Wu ordered elaborate ceremonies before any crossing attempt. Priests performed ancient rituals, while the assembled lords watched. Sacrificial animals were prepared according to proper customs. Everything had to be perfect because they were not just crossing a river, they were stepping across the line between rebellion and divine mission. Then the omens began appearing. A white fish suddenly leaped from the river directly into King Wu's boat. The gathered lords gasped in amazement. White creatures were considered especially sacred signs of heaven's favor. But more wonders followed. Fire appeared to descend from the sky, taking the shape of a red crow before vanishing. Ancient texts would later record these events as unmistakable proof that heaven was watching and approving. With the army assembled and favorable omens witnessed, King Wu read formal charges against Shang tyranny. His voice carried across the vast encampment as he listed the crimes of King Di Xin, the forced labor that killed thousands, the torture chambers where innocent officials died, the taxes that left families starving while the royal court feasted. The impressive display had its intended effect. Shang border guards could see this massive force gathering just across the river. Reports flew back to the capital, describing an army larger than anything the Zhou had ever assembled. Some Shang nobles quietly began considering which side heaven truly favored. Yet when the moment came for final decision, Jiang Ziya counseled patience. Yes, the omens looked favorable. Yes, the coalition was impressively large. But the master strategist sensed something incomplete. 2 more years of preparation would make their cause unstoppable rather than merely probable. Many allied lords disagreed strongly. They had marched far from home, gathered their warriors, and witnessed heaven's signs. Why retreat now when victory seemed within reach? But King Wu trusted his father's old advisor completely. The withdrawal disappointed some allies, but proved strategically brilliant. Those 2 additional years allowed more Shang territories to defect. more intelligence to be gathered, and more internal Shang weakening to occur. When the Zhou finally struck, their victory would be so complete that no one could doubt heaven's choice. Part 4. Crisis in Yin. Tyranny, rebellion, and the final loss of heaven's favor. The royal palace in Yin had become a place of fear. King Di Xin paced the great halls where his ancestors once ruled with confidence. But now, every shadow seemed to hide another problem. The demonstration at Mengjin had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Word traveled quickly through the kingdom that hundreds of lords had gathered to challenge his rule, claiming heaven itself supported their rebellion. Di Xin's response revealed a man growing desperate. He raised taxes again and again, demanding grain and bronze from regions already struggling to survive. When local governors protested that their people had nothing left to give, he replaced them with men who promised to extract more wealth by any means necessary. Construction projects that had once showcased royal power now became monuments to royal paranoia. Massive defensive walls rose around the capital, while forced labor gangs worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. The king's justice became increasingly harsh and unpredictable. Respected nobles who dared suggest moderation found themselves accused of disloyalty. Some were executed in gruesome public displays meant to terrorize potential critics. Others simply disappeared in the night, their families too frightened to ask questions. The royal court, once filled with wise counselors and honest advisors, gradually emptied as prudent men found excuses to return to their home territories. Those who remained were flatterers and opportunists who told Di Xin only what they thought he wanted to hear. They assured him that the Zhou threat was exaggerated, that his people loved him, that heaven still favored his rule. But outside the palace walls, reality painted a different picture. Peasant uprisings erupted in distant provinces where tax collectors had stripped communities bare. Entire noble families packed their belongings and fled eastward to Zhou territories, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Shang military strengths and weaknesses. The kingdom's borders began to crumble as well. Shang armies fighting distant tribes found themselves outnumbered and undersupplied. Resources that should have defended the frontier were instead diverted to the capital's construction projects. Enemy raids penetrated deeper into Shang territory than ever before, while local commanders received increasingly frantic orders to send their best troops to protect the royal city. Nature itself seemed to turn against the dynasty. Drought withered crops across the northern plains, while flooding destroyed villages along the great rivers. Earthquakes toppled ancestral temples, and strange lights appeared in the night sky. Court astronomers struggled to interpret these signs favorably, but whispered conversations spoke of heaven's growing anger. The people began to wonder if their king had somehow lost the cosmic approval that legitimized royal rule. Di Xin's isolation deepened with each passing month. Former allies stopped visiting the court. Provincial governors delayed responses to royal commands. Even within the capital, citizens avoided eye contact with royal processions. The king, who had once commanded respect through the sheer weight of ancestral authority, now found that respect replaced by fear, and fear proved a poor foundation for lasting loyalty. By the time reports reached Yin of Zhou armies crossing the Great River for a second time, Di Xin discovered that many of his own generals secretly sympathized with the rebels. The throne that had seemed unshakable just years before now sat atop foundations of sand, ready to collapse at the first serious blow. Part 5. The Winter March and the Battle of Muye, Heaven's Verdict on the Battlefield. King Wu understood that his moment had arrived. The winter of 1046 BCE brought reports that Di Xin's grip on power had weakened beyond repair. Peasant revolts flickered across Shang territories like scattered fires. Several key nobles had fled the capital with their retainers. Even the royal guard showed signs of wavering loyalty. The Zhou king gathered his war council and made the fateful decision. They would march east while the ground was still frozen and before Shang could prepare proper defenses. The coalition army that assembled represented years of careful alliance building. King Wu commanded roughly 45,000 Zhou warriors, disciplined and motivated by their belief in righteous cause. Allied lords brought additional troops, creating a force that numbered perhaps 65,000 in total. Unlike the ceremonial march to Mengjin years earlier, this advance moved with deadly purpose. Scouts ranged ahead. Supply lines stretched back to Zhou territories. Every man understood this campaign would end either with their victory or their deaths. Dixin received news of the Zhou approach with shock that quickly turned to rage. His advisors scrambled to assemble defenders, but the available forces revealed the depth of Shang weakness. Regular troops had been scattered across distant campaigns or lost to desertion. The king's recruiters pressed slaves into service, armed prisoners with weapons, and called up men too old or too young for proper warfare. This desperate army numbered around 70,000, but its composition guaranteed problems. Men forced to fight rarely fought well, especially for a ruler they feared and despised. The armies met at Muye, the wild fields south of the Shang capital. King Wu positioned his forces carefully, placing his most reliable Zhou veterans at key points, while positioning allied contingents where they could provide support. Before battle commenced, he addressed his troops with words that would echo through Chinese history. He spoke of heaven's will, of the righteousness of their cause, and of the moral duty to end tyranny. His voice carried across the ranks, transforming what might have been mere conquest into something approaching religious crusade. Dixin's army took the field in disarray. The pressed slaves and prisoners stood in front ranks, with reliable guards behind them to prevent retreat. This arrangement immediately revealed its fatal flaw when combat began. The first troops had no reason to die for a king they hated. As Zhou forces advanced with disciplined precision, Shang frontline units began throwing down their weapons. Some actively turned and fought against their own rear ranks. Others simply fled the battlefield entirely. The battle collapsed within hours rather than days. What should have been a grinding contest between major armies became instead a rout of unprecedented speed. King Wu's forces swept through crumbling Shang lines and advanced directly toward the capital itself. Dixin, watching his kingdom disintegrate before his eyes, made his final choice. He retreated to his palace, donned his ceremonial jade robes, and set the building ablaze around himself. When Zhou soldiers reached the royal quarters, they found only ashes and the glittering remains of imperial regalia. King Wu entered the fallen capital not as a conqueror, but as heaven's chosen instrument. The swiftness of victory stunned even his supporters. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries had fallen in a single day of fighting. To observers on all sides, such rapid collapse could only mean one thing. Heaven had withdrawn its support from Shang and granted it to Zhou. The Battle of Muye thus became more than military victory. It became proof of cosmic justice and the birth of a new age. Chapter 3: Building a World Under Heaven. Founding and Consolidation of Western Zhou Part 1. From Conqueror to King. Proclaiming the Zhou dynasty and the mandate of heaven. King Wu stood at the gates of the fallen Shang capital, but his real work had only just begun. Winning the battle was one thing. Becoming a true king was something entirely different. He needed to transform himself from a conqueror into a legitimate ruler, and he had to do it quickly before his enemies could regroup. Wu entered the city with careful ceremony, not as a destroyer, but as someone chosen by the gods. His first stop was the Shang Ancestral Temple. Here he did something that shocked many of his followers. Instead of burning down the sacred building, he performed the traditional rituals to honor the dead Shang kings. This wasn't weakness, it was brilliant politics. By respecting the ancestors, Wu showed he wasn't trying to erase the past. He was claiming to be part of a natural succession. The new king then opened the Shang prisons and released the nobles who had been locked away by the tyrant king. These grateful men spread word that Wu was merciful and just. He also took the royal treasures and distributed them among the common people, instead of keeping everything for himself. Stories of his generosity traveled fast through the city streets. But Wu's most important move came when he formally declared the creation of the Zhou dynasty. Standing before a massive crowd, he proclaimed himself the Son of Heaven. This wasn't just a fancy title. Wu was announcing a completely new idea about how kings got their power. According to Wu, heaven itself had chosen him to rule. The gods had grown disgusted with the Shang king's cruelty and corruption. They had transferred their blessing to Wu because he was virtuous and good. This became known as the Mandate of Heaven, and it changed everything about how people thought of royal power. The old way said kings ruled because their families had always ruled. The new way said kings ruled only as long as they deserved to rule. If a king became evil or failed his people, heaven would take away his mandate and give it to someone better. This made rebellion not just possible, but sometimes necessary. Wu proved his new philosophy by doing something unprecedented. He allowed a Shang prince to continue ruling a small piece of the former kingdom. This showed Wu's confidence and mercy. He wasn't afraid of leaving Shang survivors because heaven was on his side. Messengers rode out to distant kingdoms carrying news of the change. Bronze workers began crafting vessels inscribed with the story of heaven's judgment. These weren't just decorations. They were permanent records that would tell future generations why the Zhou had the right to rule. Through these careful steps, Wu transformed a military conquest into divine approval. He had created not just a new dynasty, but a new way of thinking about power itself. Part 2. Shared rule of earth and heaven, the Duke of Zhou as regent and architect. But Wu's triumph would last only 3 short years. In 1043 BCE, the great conqueror died suddenly, leaving behind a child too young to rule. The boy, Prince Cheng, had barely learned to walk, let alone govern an empire. This created a crisis that threatened everything Wu had built. Wu's younger brother, the Duke of Zhou, stepped forward to claim the regency. Jiang was a learned man who understood both warfare and ritual. He argued that someone must guide the realm until the boy could take power himself. But his decision sparked immediate suspicion among other royal brothers. Why should he rule instead of them? Whispers spread through the court that the duke planned to steal the throne for himself. These suspicions erupted into open rebellion. 3 of Wu's other brothers, known as the Three Guards, turned against the duke. They had been stationed in former Shang territories to keep watch over conquered peoples. Now they declared the duke a usurper and called for war. Even more dangerous, they convinced scattered Shang remnants to join their cause. The old dynasty's supporters saw a chance to restore their fallen kingdom. For 3 brutal years, civil war tore through the realm. The Duke of Zhou led armies eastward into former Shang lands, fighting both his own family and enemy survivors. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Farmers fled their fields as soldiers marched back and forth across the countryside. The new dynasty seemed ready to collapse before it had truly begun. Throughout these dark years, the Duke made bold claims about heaven's judgment. He declared that his rebel brothers had lost heaven's favor through their treachery. Only loyal servants deserved divine support. These weren't just military slogans. They became central ideas about how heaven chose rulers based on their actions, not their bloodlines. By 1040 BCE, the Duke's forces had crushed the rebellion. His brothers fled or died. Shang resistance crumbled. Zhou control now stretched further east than ever before, reaching territories Wu had never held. The victory proved the Duke's military skill, but questions about his true intentions remained. Then the Duke did something that shocked everyone. As King Cheng reached maturity, the regent handed over full royal power without hesitation. He could have kept the throne for himself. Instead, he stepped aside and became the young king's advisor. This act proved his loyalty beyond doubt and established him as the ideal regent. The Duke spent his remaining years creating systems that would outlast any individual ruler. He organized government offices, standardized rituals, and most importantly, developed detailed explanations of how the mandate worked. These became the foundation for a new understanding of legitimate rule that would shape Chinese politics for thousands of years. Part 3. New Capitals, New Rituals, Fenghao, Luoyi, and the Sacral Geography of Rule. The Duke of Zhou had proven that virtue mattered more than bloodline. Now, the dynasty needed to build something lasting. The early Zhou kings understood that their new way of ruling required new spaces to match their grand claims about heaven's favor. King Wu had begun the work, but it was King Shang and his advisors who truly created the physical world that would house Zhou power. They chose the Wei River Valley as their heartland, where fertile soil and protective mountains created a natural fortress. Here they built not one capital, but two. Feng became the ritual center where kings performed the ceremonies that connected them to heaven. Massive ancestral temples rose from the earth, their wooden columns reaching toward the sky like prayers made solid. Inside these halls, bronze vessels held offerings to the royal ancestors who had died and now lived among the spirits. The ceremonies followed precise patterns passed down from the Duke of Zhou himself. Hao served as the administrative capital where daily government business took place. Officials lived in compounds, arranged according to strict rules about rank and position. Even the buildings themselves told the story of Zhou order. The highest roofs belonged to the king, lower ones to nobles, and simple structures housed common workers. The kings created a calendar that told them when to perform each ritual. Spring ceremonies welcomed new growth. Summer rites ensured good harvests. Autumn sacrifices thanked heaven for abundance. Winter observances prepared for the dark months ahead. These weren't just religious events. They were political statements that showed the king maintaining cosmic balance. Music filled these ceremonies with sounds that reinforced the social order. Different instruments played for different ranks of people. Bells chimed for nobles, drums beat for warriors, simple flutes sang for farmers. Every note had its place, just like every person in Zhou society. But the Zhou faced a practical problem. Their conquest had given them vast eastern territories where former Shang people lived. These lands needed governing, but they lay hundreds of miles from the western capitals. The solution came during King Cheng's reign with the founding of Luoyi, an eastern capital near modern Luoyang. Luoyi served multiple purposes. It housed Zhou officials who could watch over former Shang territories. It provided a place where eastern nobles could come to pay respects without the long journey west. Most importantly, it symbolized the joining of old and new. Former Shang aristocrats could see Zhou power established in familiar surroundings while acknowledging their new rulers. The landscape itself became part of Zhou claims to legitimacy. Sacred mountains marked the boundaries of royal authority. Rivers carried the waters blessed by royal ceremonies. Royal tombs dotted the countryside, each one a reminder that deceased kings continued watching over the realm from their place among the ancestors. This careful arrangement of space and ceremony created something new in Chinese history. Previous rulers had simply conquered and demanded obedience. The Zhou built a world that made their authority seem natural and eternal. Part 4. Feudal Bonds of Bronze, Enfeoffment of Clans, and the Spread of Zhou Authority. The Zhou kings knew they could not personally rule every corner of their vast domain. The distances were too great and communication too slow for one man to control territories stretching from the western highlands to the eastern plains. Their solution created a system that would shape Chinese politics for centuries. They gave away pieces of their kingdom to trusted people who would rule in their name. This process began with careful ceremony. The king would summon a chosen lord to his court, often a brother, cousin, or loyal general, who had proven himself in battle. In the Great Hall, surrounded by bronze vessels and ancestral tablets, the king would perform an ancient ritual. He handed the lord a clod of earth wrapped in colored silk, symbolizing the territory being granted. He presented bronze vessels inscribed with the terms of the agreement, making the contract sacred and permanent. These weren't simple gifts, but binding oaths witnessed by heaven itself. The bronze inscriptions told future generations exactly what each lord owed his king. They must send tribute each year, usually grain, silk, or local products that showed their territory's prosperity. They must come to court when summoned, bringing their retinues to demonstrate loyalty and receive new instructions. Most importantly, they must provide soldiers when war called, marching under royal banners to defend the realm or expand its borders. Royal relatives received the choicest territories, especially lands that had once belonged to the Shang. The king's brothers and sons became dukes and marquises, creating a network of family loyalty that stretched across the kingdom. Former Shang nobles who submitted peacefully sometimes kept reduced holdings, but always under the watchful eyes of nearby Zhou kinsmen. This prevented any restoration attempts while showing royal mercy to those who accepted the new order. Each lord replicated Zhou rituals in his own domain. They built ancestral temples modeled after those in the capital. They performed seasonal ceremonies that matched the royal calendar. They adopted Zhou legal customs and administrative practices. This created cultural unity across diverse regions, making Zhou authority feel natural rather than foreign. The system created a pyramid of power that theoretically reached every peasant village. The king ruled through dukes, who commanded marquises, who oversaw counts, who governed local areas. Each level owed loyalty upward while protecting those below. Bronze vessels passed down through generations reminded each family of their sacred obligations to the throne. This feudal network spread Zhou influence far beyond what armies alone could achieve. Local lords became invested in the dynasty's success because their own authority depended on royal legitimacy. If the mandate of heaven protected the king, it also protected them. Their rule became an extension of cosmic order rather than simple conquest. The bonds forged in bronze and oath created stability that lasted for generations. Yet they also planted seeds of future problems as lords grew powerful in distant territories while royal control gradually weakened over time. Part 5. Law, Oaths, and Moral Order, Codifying the Mandate as Political Philosophy. As Zhou power spread across the land, royal scribes faced a pressing challenge. How can they transform a conquest story into lasting rules for government? The answer emerged through countless discussions in palace halls and careful writing of official documents. What started as justification for overthrowing the Shang gradually became something much bigger, a complete theory of how rulers should govern. The scribes began recording detailed accounts of what heaven expected from kings. These writings, later gathered into texts like the Book of Documents, spelled out clear requirements. A worthy ruler must govern justly, showing moderation in all things. He must care for common people, not just nobles. He must perform rituals correctly and constantly work to improve his own character. Most importantly, he must remember that his power came from heaven, not from his family bloodline. This created something remarkable in human history. For the first time, a ruler's legitimacy depended on his behavior rather than his birth. Heaven could withdraw its support from any king who failed his duties. Natural disasters became cosmic warning signs. When floods destroyed crops or earthquakes shook the kingdom, advisors would rush to the palace with urgent counsel. These calamities meant heaven was growing angry. The king must reform his ways or risk losing the throne entirely. The Zhou developed an intricate system of cosmic accountability. Royal advisors gained enormous importance because they helped kings maintain heaven's favor. Good advisors who spoke honestly about royal mistakes became heroes of statecraft. Those who flattered rulers and ignored problems became villains who endangered the entire kingdom. This created a culture where moral criticism of power was not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. The most revolutionary idea was that dynasty change was natural and right. When kings became corrupt, heaven would choose new rulers from different families entirely. This meant the Zhou themselves could be replaced if they failed their duties. Rather than weakening royal authority, this concept actually strengthened it by making each king responsible for proving his worth. Common people benefited from this philosophy because rulers were supposed to protect their welfare. Kings who ignored famines or allowed corruption faced cosmic punishment. The phrase, "serve heaven and protect the people," became the core duty of Chinese emperors for thousands of years. These early Zhou political writings established principles that would echo through Chinese history long after the dynasty itself crumbled. Every future emperor would claim the mandate of heaven. Every rebellion would justify itself by accusing rulers of losing cosmic favor. The idea that moral character, rather than bloodline, determined legitimate rule became one of China's greatest contributions to political thought worldwide. Chapter 4. Cracks in Heaven's Seal, Challenges, Transformations, and the Mandate's Long Shadow. Part 1. Rebellious Lords and Warning Omens. Early strains in the Zhou order. The Zhou system began showing cracks as early as the 10th century. Regional lords who had once rushed to answer the king's call started making excuses. Some simply ignored royal summons to court. Others found reasons to avoid sending troops when the king needed military help. What had once been automatic obedience became negotiation. Private wars broke out between neighboring lords without the king's permission. These regional rulers started settling disputes with their own armies rather than bringing complaints to the royal court. The Zhou king, who was supposed to be the final judge of all conflicts, found himself watching from the sidelines as his vassals fought each other. Time weakened the family bonds that had once held the system together. When the Zhou first conquered China, they had placed relatives and trusted allies as lords over distant territories. These men remembered their connection to the royal house, but their sons and grandsons felt less loyalty to distant cousins in the capital. By the third and fourth generations, many lords barely remembered why they owed anything to the Zhou king at all. Nature seemed to be sending warning signals. Solar eclipses darkened the sky at unexpected moments. Earthquakes shook the royal palaces. Floods destroyed crops and left people hungry. The court's record keepers nervously wrote down each strange event. According to Zhou beliefs, these could be signs that heaven was growing unhappy with the dynasty's performance. The king's advisors scrambled to respond to these troubling signs. They organized new religious ceremonies to show heaven that the Zhou still deserved to rule. Officials traveled throughout the kingdom preaching about proper behavior and moral duty. They reminded lords about their sacred obligations under the mandate of heaven. Sometimes the king tried using force. Royal armies marched against especially rebellious lords to remind them who was really in charge. These military campaigns had mixed results. Some defiant nobles submitted, at least temporarily. Others simply moved their rebellion underground or waited for the royal army to leave. The gap between theory and reality grew wider each year. On paper, the Zhou king remained the son of heaven, chosen by the gods to rule all of China. In practice, regional lords made their own decisions about war, peace, and local government. They still performed the ritual ceremonies that acknowledged royal supremacy, but these increasingly felt like empty gestures. What worried court officials most was how this pattern seemed to be accelerating. Each generation of lords felt more independent than the last. Each natural disaster raised more questions about heaven's continued support. The system that had once seemed divinely ordained now required constant effort to maintain, and even that effort was yielding diminishing returns. These early cracks would soon become major fractures, setting the stage for the Zhou dynasty's most dramatic challenges yet to come. Part 2. Cultural flourishing under tension, ritual texts, music, and the vision of a harmonious Zhou world. Even as the Zhou kingdom faced growing challenges from rebellious lords and troubling omens, something remarkable was happening in the courts and workshops across the realm. Artists, scholars, and craftsmen were creating some of the most beautiful and sophisticated works in Chinese history. This cultural explosion seemed almost defiant, as if the kingdom was declaring its greatness just when that greatness was being questioned. The royal scribes worked tirelessly to produce magnificent texts that celebrated Zhou ideals. They wrote elaborate descriptions of perfect ceremonies, detailed accounts of how nobles should behave, and glowing histories of Zhou victories. These documents painted a picture of a harmonious world where everyone knew their place and heaven smiled down on righteous rulers. The scribes used increasingly complex characters and beautiful calligraphy, turning simple records into works of art. Musicians and dancers at the royal court developed performances that were said to mirror the movements of the stars and planets. They believed that when humans performed these ceremonies correctly, they created harmony between earth and heaven. Bells rang in precise sequences, dancers moved in patterns that represented cosmic forces, and singers performed ancient songs that told stories of Zhou virtue and divine favor. The bronze workers of this period created vessels that were true masterpieces. These weren't just containers for food and wine during ceremonies. Each piece was covered with intricate designs and lengthy inscriptions that told stories of Zhou achievements. The inscriptions grew longer and more elaborate with each generation, as if the craftsmen felt compelled to explain and justify Zhou rule in ever greater detail. Poetry flourished in unexpected ways during this tense period. Court poets wrote formal verses celebrating royal hunts and noble marriages. But they also collected folk songs from common people across the kingdom. These simple songs about farming, love, and daily life were carefully preserved alongside the grand court poems. Together, they created a picture of Zhou society from top to bottom. A new class of educated people emerged during this time. These scribes and ritual specialists could read and write, understood complex ceremonies, and served as links between the royal court and local communities. They became the keepers of Zhou culture, memorizing poems, perfecting rituals, and maintaining the records that proved Zhou legitimacy. But there was something almost desperate about all this cultural activity. The more the kingdom's unity cracked, the more beautiful and elaborate its cultural productions became. It was as if everyone involved understood that they were creating something precious that might not survive the growing political chaos. These works served two purposes simultaneously. They genuinely tried to hold society together through shared values and beautiful traditions. But they also worked as sophisticated propaganda, projecting an image of Zhou perfection that masked deepening problems. The irony was profound. Just as real Zhou power was fragmenting, the ideal of Zhou civilization was reaching its most refined and influential form. This cultural legacy would outlast the political reality by thousands of years. Part 3. The Fall of Western Zhou, the Sack of Haojing and Flight East. King Yu took the throne in 781 BCE, but he was not the kind of man heaven expected to rule. Where his ancestors had been careful and wise, Yu was reckless and selfish. He made decisions based on his personal desires rather than the good of the kingdom. This would prove to be a terrible mistake that would destroy everything the Zhou had built. The king fell deeply in love with a woman named Bao Si. She was beautiful, but came from outside the royal family. Yu was so captivated by her that he did something shocking. He threw out his legitimate queen and made Bao Si his new wife. This was not just a personal choice. It broke sacred traditions and insulted powerful noble families, who had marriage ties to the original queen. The deposed queen's father was furious and felt deeply humiliated. Bao Si had a strange personality. Court records say she rarely smiled and seemed bored by everything around her. King Yu became obsessed with making her happy. He would do anything to see her laugh, even if it meant abandoning his royal duties. The nobles watched in horror as their king spent his time trying to entertain one woman instead of governing the kingdom. The most famous story tells how Yu discovered that Bao Si smiled when she saw the warning beacon fires. These fires were supposed to alert the kingdom when enemies approached. When lit, lords from across the realm would rush with their armies to defend the capital. Yu thought it was amusing to light the fires when there was no danger, just to see Bao Si's rare smile when confused armies arrived for nothing. He did this repeatedly, treating the kingdom's defense system like a game. After several false alarms, the lords stopped responding. They grew tired of racing to the capital, only to find the king and his consort laughing at them. Trust between the king and his nobles completely broke down. Meanwhile, real threats were growing stronger. The Quanrong people from the northwest had been watching Zhou weakness with interest. In 771 BCE, disaster struck. The deposed queen's father made a deal with the Quanrong raiders. Together, they launched a massive attack on Haojing, the western capital. When King Yu finally lit the beacon fires for real, no one came. The lords he had fooled so many times assumed it was another joke. The king found himself facing the enemy alone with only his personal guards. The battle was swift and brutal. King Yu died fighting, cut down as enemies stormed through his palace. The Quanrong warriors and their noble allies sacked the capital, burning buildings and stealing treasures that had been accumulating for centuries. Everything the Zhou had built in the west was destroyed in a matter of days. The surviving court officials grabbed the young prince who would become King Ping and fled eastward toward their secondary capital at Luoyi. They carried whatever they could save from the ruins. As they looked back at the smoking remains of Haojing, everyone understood what had happened. Heaven had grown disgusted with King Yu's behavior and withdrawn its protection from the Zhou. Part 4. Mandate Without Power, the Eastern Zhou Kings and the Age of Competing Lords. The survivors of Zhou's royal court arrived at Luoyi in 770 BCE, carrying little more than ceremonial robes and broken dreams. King Ping, barely old enough to understand what had happened, found himself ruler of a kingdom that existed mostly in name. The eastern capital was smaller and less grand than the magnificent Haojing they had fled. Worse still, the royal domain around Luoyi was tiny compared to what the Zhou kings once controlled. The great lords who had once bowed before Zhou power now ruled territories larger and richer than the king's own lands. States like Jin, Qi, and Chu had grown into major powers during the chaos. Their armies numbered in the tens of thousands, while King Ping struggled to field even a few hundred soldiers. The king who claimed to rule everything under heaven could barely protect his own palace walls. Yet something strange happened in this new world. The lords still called themselves vassals of the Zhou king. They still dated their documents according to his reign years. When they held important ceremonies, they followed rituals that recognized the king as son of heaven. The Zhou had lost their power, but somehow kept their prestige. This created a bizarre situation that would define the next 5 centuries. Powerful lords like Duke Huan of Qi would conquer territory and build vast armies, then politely ask the Zhou king to confirm their actions. They claimed to act as his representatives while doing exactly what they wanted. The king would issue proclamations that everyone ignored, then perform elaborate ceremonies that everyone attended. The mandate of heaven idea that the Zhou had created to justify their own rule now worked against them. Other lords began claiming that heaven favored them instead of the weak Zhou kings. If the Zhou truly held heaven's blessing, they asked, why were they so powerless? If heaven wanted order in the world, perhaps new leadership was needed. Regional strongmen called themselves hegemons and promised to restore proper order in the king's name. Du Quan of Qi organized other lords into alliances supposedly to protect Zhou authority. In reality, he was building his own power network. These hegemons held grand meetings where they made treaties and divided territory, always careful to invite the Zhou king to provide ceremonial approval for what they had already decided. The Zhou kings played along because they had no choice. They still controlled the ritual calendar that marked planting and harvest seasons. Lords still needed their blessing to legitimize marriages and succession claims. The king remained the link between earth and heaven, even if he could not control what happened on earth. This arrangement suited everyone in its own twisted way. The lords got to pursue their ambitions while claiming legitimate authority. The king kept his dignity and ceremonial role while avoiding the costs of actually governing. The mandate of heaven remained intact as an idea, even as it became a weapon that any ambitious lord could wield against Zhou rule itself. Part 5. Heaven's idea becomes China's heritage, from Zhou doctrine to imperial tradition. The fall of the Zhou monarchy did not mean the end of their greatest invention. The mandate of heaven had become far too useful to die with its creators. When ambitious leaders throughout Chinese history needed to justify overthrowing rulers, they reached for the same basic argument the Zhou had used against the Shang over 1,000 years earlier. The first to master this political tool were the Qin rulers. In 221 BCE, when King Jiang conquered all rival states and declared himself the first emperor, he claimed heaven had transferred its favor from the corrupt warring kingdoms to his unified regime. The Zhou idea had come full circle. A doctrine created to justify rebellion against the Shang now justified rebellion against the Zhou and their successor states. The Han dynasty that followed the short-lived Qin understood the power of this concept even better. Han emperors made the mandate of heaven official government policy. They created an entire bureaucracy devoted to reading heaven's will through natural signs. Eclipses meant imperial displeasure. Floods suggested moral failure at court. Unusual animal births warned of coming changes. A whole class of scholars made careers interpreting these supposed divine messages. This system created a strange balance of power. Emperors could claim divine backing for their rule, which made them incredibly powerful. But they also had to constantly prove their worthiness or risk losing that same divine support. Bad harvests or natural disasters could spark rebellions led by people claiming heaven wanted new leadership. The doctrine that made emperors strong also made them vulnerable. Every major dynastic change in Chinese history followed this same pattern. The Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties all rose to power, claiming heaven had withdrawn support from corrupt predecessors and granted them the right to rule instead. The specific details changed, but the basic story remained the same across 15 centuries. Confucian scholars embraced this idea because it aligned with their belief that good government required moral leadership. They taught that virtuous rulers would enjoy divine favor while corrupt ones would face heavenly punishment. This created pressure for emperors to at least appear virtuous, even when their private behavior fell short of ideal standards. Chinese historians use the mandate of heaven to explain the rise and fall of dynasties as natural cycles. They wrote that dynasties began with virtuous founders, gradually became corrupt through luxury and power, lost heaven's favor through moral failure, and fell to new dynasties blessed with divine approval. This pattern repeated throughout Chinese history. The concept survived until the very end of imperial China. Even in 1911, when revolutionaries overthrew the Qing dynasty, Some argued they were fulfilling heaven's will by removing a government that had lost divine support. A political idea born from Bronze Age tribal warfare had shaped Chinese civilization for over 3,000 years, making it one of history's most enduring innovations in political thought.